Morning everyone, and a very warm welcome to this morning's webinar. I'm Carol Patrick from the Trust and I'll be your chair this morning. I joined the Trust back in 2013, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, so I've been on this journey since it all began. It seems incredible that we're now approaching the end of our chapter, but it's a great opportunity for us to reflect and share some of our learning. Today, our focus is on leaving a positive legacy in the funding world. We plan to share some of the learning we've gained as a funder over the past 9 years or so. To do that, it's important that we explain what we do and how we do it, as well as share some insights into the positive impact of working in this way. So, back in 2013, the Life Changes Trust was established by the National Lottery Community Fund as a time-limited trust with a spend-out endowment of £50 million. This endowment was to benefit young people with care experience, people living with dementia, and the unpaid carers of people living with dementia. Our aim has always been to get alongside people living with dementia, unpaid carers, and young people with care experience so that they can be influential, build strong relationships, and exercise their rights. Listening to and amplifying and acting upon the voice of the people that we're here for is woven deep into the fabric of the Trust. Over the past 9 years, we hope that we've developed a keen understanding about what leads to significant and positive change in people's lives. Drawn on that understanding, we've produced 4 booklets to share some of our learning with other funders in quite a practical way. Last week, we held a webinar focusing on 2 of those publications, putting beneficiaries at the heart of funding and relationship-based funding. Today, we're turning our attention to the other publications, being a flexible funder and being a strategic funder. It's no surprise that there's a lot of overlap and synergy between all of these topics, as each booklet draws on the Trust's learning and experience of focusing on relationships, co-production, empowerment, flexibility, strategic thinking, and lived experience. So lots to pack into these publications. Before we jump in, there's just a few housekeeping points to quickly run through, which I know we all love. There's no break scheduled in today's programme, but if you need some time away from your screen, then please take a break when you need to. The event's been recorded and it will be on the Life Changes website soon, so you can catch up then if you miss anything. And we'll email everyone when this is available. Later on in the webinar, we'll be having a Q&A panel session, and we've got some funders joining us for that. If you'd like to ask a question of the panel, then you can put your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And there's also a chat section, so if you've got any general comments or thoughts as we're running through our programme today, then please do share them. In the chat function, there's a drop-down menu, and this gives you the option to share your comments with the panel or with everyone. It's good to share, so please remember to select the with everyone option if you're happy to do that. So thanks for bearing with me, and we can crack on with today's event. As I mentioned, we're going to be zooming in on the topics of flexible funding and strategic funding. And in order to do that, it's worth going right back to the start, to 2013, when the National Lottery Community Fund set up the Life Changes Trust. We were a new entrant into the funding landscape with an ambitious remit. And for both the fund and the trust, it was all new territory. We thought it'd be really useful to get the perspective of Neil Rich, Scotland Director at the fund, who's been part of the story from the very beginning. So I caught up with Neil to ask him about how it all started, why the fund set up the trust in the first place, and 9 years later, his reflections on our journey. Here's what he had to say. Hi there, Neil. Thanks very much for joining us today, just for a bit of a chat and a bit of background into the Life Changes Trust and National Lottery Community Fund, and I guess our relationship. So really appreciate you giving us a bit of time.
Thanks for having me along. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. All right, so I'll get the grilling underway. So the first question for you really is, I want to just sort of take you back in time, really, I guess, to, before the trust was set up. Could you give us a bit of background into why it was Big Lottery Fund at the time, I think, why the fund was keen to set up an independent trust, and what you hoped that you would achieve?
Yeah, so you have to go back to kind of 2009, 2010 to the work to set up Life Changes Trust, and there were a number of things going on at the time. I think there were kind of three very important things going on. So there was a lot of work around the life outcomes for young people leaving the care system in Scotland, and what could we do to improve that substantially, because the comparison to other countries was pretty salutary. There's emerging work around working with older people as well in areas like dementia and care of older people, and a real groundswell of work around voice and the voice of experienced people and decisions that affected them. So all of those things were kind of in the policy side. And then there's a bit of a technical grant making thing going on, which is National Lottery funders are project funders, time limited funders, but now and again we try and fund into what we grandly call more strategic issues. And these felt like things that could benefit from deeper, longer term investment. And there's also a bit of a limitation to what we do as a funder around really engaging with people and developing specialist skills around seeking to directly influence policy or advocate. And also our expertise is in being a funder. It's not in interventions with specific people. We have lots of great folk at the fund who know lots about that stuff, but we want it to be able to see what could be done by a really committed organisation focused on these two issues, with a substantial, secure investment over a period of time. So that's why we set up Life Changes Trust. And the goal is what's set out in the trust deed. It was to transform the life chances and opportunities for people who had experience of the care system in Scotland, and also people affected by dementia and those who cared for those people.
And so, yeah, so once we were set up then, were there any surprises for you in terms of the direction that we took as an organisation?
I don't know, to be surprised, we've had to have a very firm view about what we expected to do, right? And I think for us, what was really, really interesting was some of the work around, well, how do you frame this problem? How do you deal with this problem? How do you really engage voice? And I remember early on some of the work around how you support people with dementia to be involved in things like medical conferences, or to be able to express what they wanted to do. And some of that felt really new and fresh. And then lots of the work around care experienced young people and just really supporting those strong voices. So I don't know if any of that was surprising, but it was exciting.
Yeah, so a bit of a sense of maybe journeying into unknown territory, even from the early stages. But you were kind of alluding there to maybe at the beginning of the relationship, you know, some kind of thoughts at the fund about the pace and how that was going. Obviously that relationship's developed over time, and it's been an important one, the relationship between the trust and the National Lottery Community Fund. How would you describe it now, do you think?
I think it feels like a pretty mature partnership. I think partnerships are, is it the most abused word in funding? It's that of community, right? But partnership in that very real sense, I think we've been able to be pretty supportive of each other as organisations. You know, we haven't got upset when you've nicked loads of our staff, for example. And I think we've also learned from the trust, and I think some of the work you guys have done has influenced how we've thought about things, and that's felt really positive. So there's that relationship, and I think I was thinking about this the other day actually. At the fund, I think we have a certain pride in what you guys have achieved at Life Changes Trust, and I guess it's kind of, see, I'm getting older now, and I guess it's kind of like maybe watching your grandkids do something really good or do something really cool. So there's a bit of that as well, that kind of pride in how the trusts work.
Oh, that's a really great way of thinking about it. And yeah, I mean, I think I have apologised already, but I am sorry that we did draw in quite so many of your staff. But I think it sort of captures that element of there has been quite a bit of cross-fertilisation, because the staff that came to the trust from NLCF, they brought, a lot of robustness and discipline around funding just at the right time for us, and they obviously brought other expertise and knowledge. So it's been, I think there's been a good sort of two-way flow between the organisations that's been pretty important to both of us in different ways. Yeah. Okay, so the topic of this webinar is obviously strategic funding. It might seem, I guess, a bit like one of these sort of jargon phrases, but what does strategic funding mean to you? What comes to mind?
I suppose that there's a couple of things that feel important around strategic funding. There's a criticism of a lot of strategy that says we make a lot of plans that we call strategies. So strategic funding should be funding that shapes the environment as much as just delivers specific outcomes, I think, and challenges some of our thinking, because it should have an impact that's wider than just its pure delivery. And so sometimes as well, that can actually be about sometimes quite short-term, quite impactful funding. But I think mostly when we think of strategic funding, certainly the way we think of it, National Community Fund, we think of it as being longer term, maybe a bit more patient, maybe with a certain level of innovation, but also focused on some specific area. There's a really good book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by a guy called Richard Rumelt, and early on he says a bad strategy is a strategy that requires 6 helicopters when you don't have 6 helicopters. And so strategic funding needs to be about, for us, taking a topic, an area or a theme that is of a manageable scale. So you need a certain level of focus, but you also need a certain level of scale, and you need to try and hit that area in the middle of those two things, and that can make a significant difference over time. And there's lots and lots of chat in the funding world about, how much money do you throw at something? I don't think that's what strategic funding is. It's about resources, but it's also about thinking and connections and working with the grain of what exists, but also sometimes challenging what exists.
That's really interesting. I've had a few conversations with people recently, obviously just reflecting on the experience of the trust, but also preparing to kind of hand things over, pass the baton on to people that we know want to build and grow the work that we started. Your point about sometimes doing that work strategically means challenging some of the kind of existing practices and some of the status quo, I guess, and that definitely feels recognisable. I think, thinking back to the earlier days of the trust, I think some people were a bit surprised about the way that we were approaching things, and particularly our determination to connect really directly with people living with dementia, unpaid carers and young people with care experience. I think that did maybe upset some expectations, but it felt really important to us, if we were going to make a strategic difference, that we were really alongside people with lived experience, and that was a central aspect of our work. Yeah. All right, so the next question then is about flexibility. I mean, it's been really important to us as a funder to try and work flexibly with the projects that we funded and the people that we're alongside. What's your take on flexible funding? How important do you think it is?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I think if we've learned anything over the past couple of years, it's that line about the best laid plans, isn't it? And often what you see as a funder is you see people presenting you with an application or a scenario that says, this is the situation, this is what we're going to do, this is what we think will change. And of course, you make a kind of decision at a fixed point in time to invest in something, and then stuff happens, life intervenes. You introduce people into the scenario, and actually those people have slightly different ideas and different interpretations. And so funding needs to be at least flexible enough to deal with the fact that nothing quite turns out the way you expected. So as a minimum, I think any funder that is really, really rigid about what it expects to see is going to have a difficult time, to be honest. And I think the other thing is that that we've learned in the past couple of years is the importance of allowing organisations to respond to what's important at the time on the ground. And if if the world changes round about you, you better be ready to flex too, because in the end, you know, we're entrusted with public money at the National Lottery Community Fund, and our job is to make sure that money works as hard as it can and does the best it can for the communities that, frankly, it came from in the first place. And to do that, you have to be willing to work with folk and work with what need emerges. You need to be able to let folk learn and change, you know. Big private sector companies don't say, well, we started making blue jumpers and we don't care if folk want red ones. And similarly, you have to expect other organisations to be able to react like that, don't you? So flexible funding feels really important. The other thing that feels important is that funding models suit the issue or the organisation or the people you're working with.
Yeah, and as you say, the pandemic, if it's taught us anything, it's that, you know, however many plans we make and however much we think we've mapped out what lies in front of us, then sometimes events just take over.
Aye.
And I think we've seen, you know, people in the funding world doing things that they just, you know, previously would have thought would not have been possible in terms of their funding relationships and what they ask of people. And you touched on this earlier, Neil, but you know, what kind of influence do you think setting up the trust has had on NLCF? And have you seen any changes in the fund? And are there any further changes that you might like to see in the future as a result of having the trust?
I think the thing that working with the trust has probably influenced the most is our thinking around how you engage people with expertise that they've gained through their own experience in issues that affect them. And some of that's about technique and about thinking really hard about what you can do and what it takes to do some of that stuff well. And sometimes that affects decisions not to push into that territory where you maybe don't feel like you have the right resource or the right capacity to do that well. And other times I think it has a more pervasive impact on our work, and we seek to do that more. So we are constantly seeking to get closer to the communities we serve. We serve a very broad range of people across Scotland. So the way we've done that is particularly through place-based work, and you can see some parallels with like the regional events that you guys have been running with the dementia programme, or engaging with other bodies. So in that sense, I think we're in a space where we're trying to be an organisation that is more connected to a set of voices who are in the communities we serve. I think that's a long-term project. You're never done, I think, in that work. But I think there's kind of a sense of what it takes to do that well that we've probably picked up from the trust.
It's great to hear, and I think it kind of captures that idea maybe of ripple effects, which is something that we've been talking about quite a lot in relation to the impact of the trust more generally, and that it's sometimes multiple different waves, as you put it kind of earlier on. Okay, thanks so much, Neil, for sharing a bit of time with us and giving us your thoughts today. That's been really great. Yeah, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks very much.
We're really grateful to Neil for giving his time to help us set the scene today. He obviously still hasn't quite forgiven us for ruthlessly poaching staff from the fund, but what can we say? We've benefited hugely from members of the team joining us, and we do hope that the benefits have been two-way, as people will continue their journeys in the funding world as our chapter comes to an end. So now we're going to take a brief dive into our booklets on flexible funding and strategic funding. At the Trust, we believe that a flexible approach to funding, not just in terms of how and what we fund, but also in our approach to funding management and taking risks, achieves better outcomes for the people that we work with. We also believe it supports our strategic ambitions. These booklets explain what flexible funding can look like in practice and how and why it works. They also explore what a strategic approach to funding means and the benefits for funders in adopting these approaches. My colleague Arlene Crockett is now going to give us the headline takeaways for each of these booklets. So I'll just ask Arlene to join me, my fellow joint CEO and Director of the Dementia Programme here at the Trust. Welcome, Arlene. I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you, Carol, for that introduction. So at our webinar last Wednesday that we referenced, my colleagues Celeste and Colm gave a brief overview of the booklets covering putting beneficiaries at the heart of funding and relationship-based funding. So the pressure is on, I'm afraid, as they did such a good job. And so today I'm going to do my very best to provide an overview of the booklets, as Carol said, about being a flexible funder and a strategic funder. At the Trust, when we talk about flexible funding, we describe it as striking a balance between achieving the best outcomes for beneficiaries and setting out the best approach to making this happen. Our approach as a flexible funder was certainly put to the test recently during COVID-19, like many others. We needed to act quickly whilst ensuring the outcomes for people with dementia, for unpaid carers and for young people were maximised. The Flexible Funding Booklet outlines some key steps identified by the Trust as key to being or becoming a flexible funder. First, it's about developing funding programmes. The principles of flexible funding, such as trust, adapting to change and targeting specific areas of work, are woven through the framework of the Life Changes Trust. These principles are used when it comes to developing specific programmes. The booklet cites many examples of this, including our work with dementia-friendly communities, the recent Caring for the Carer programme, and the Keep Well Fund. Thinking about accessible application and assessment processes, flexibility applies to many areas of funding by the Trust, but what we would say our greatest impact has been is with our small grants. For example, Caring for the Carer and My Choice, My Future have straightforward application routes with options for applicants to apply, for example, online, by telephone, and in some cases using videos. We then invited our beneficiaries to be the decision makers for some of the grants, providing support and in some cases being a critical friend when needed, demonstrating that co-production really does work and the benefits reach way beyond the funding itself. Having a robust due diligence process in place means the Trust is able to look at ways of being more flexible for certain programmes and for grants. The due diligence process has obviously had to be adapted due to the pandemic, but overall, the Trust has always made sure that the level of due diligence is responsive to the particular programmes it is aimed at. Funding staff apply flexibility in their own approach to grant management, which allows discussions around budget underspend, timelines for projects and changes to project delivery. This approach works because we place importance in developing good relationships between funding staff and the organisations that we fund. Flexibility in project delivery outcomes from the Trust having faith in the ability of awardees to complete the work they set out to do. The delivery of a project is initially stipulated on the application form and agreed upon as part of a funding award. However, what we have faced over the last 2 years has meant we have had to factor in additional flexibility around project plans, meaning the route to achieving objectives and some outcomes may change over the lifetime of the grant. You will hear more about this from Julie at Dementia Friendly Press Week a bit later on when she chats to Colin. Our approach to grant monitoring is flexible, and it's just as important to find ways to best support those participating in projects as it is to ensuring that the best evidence is in place to shine a light on the work. The Flexible Funding Booklet ends with a list of top 10 tips, which I am not going to read out, safe to say, but if you don't have time to read the whole booklet, it is only 16 pages, so it shouldn't be much of a problem. Then the top tips will certainly give you what you need to build on what you're already doing or to get started on something new. And so to strategic funding. Regardless of the size and the income of a funder, a well thought out strategy is necessary so that every penny has a purpose that brings benefit. So, and often this will be something that a lot of you on the call will know about already, but a simple strategy should ask, what are the overall aims? Which organisations or types of organisations it is that you want to fund? How much money do you want to give out? How long? What are the timelines for the funding and grant making? Does the work that you're being asked to fund fit with your stated aims as a funder? And how will you monitor progress and evaluate the impact once the funding has been awarded? The Strategic Funding Booklet highlights the core elements of being a strategic funder based on what we've experienced as a trust. Identifying a role as a highly strategic funder, having a clear funding approach, our ability to fund individuals, and funding at a local and regional level as well as nationally. We illustrate the importance of evidence and evaluation in our work and give examples of the impact this has had and set out the key benefits of being a highly strategic funder. What can be learned by our approach is that it's more than getting the money out there, but it's about having the ability to analyse the landscape and know about your beneficiaries. It's about thinking beyond traditional approaches and being comfortable about taking risks. It's multi-layered, and it's about more than simply funding. It's about evidence, and it's about influence too. And it's about being prepared to be part of the long game. That it's about making a difference over time, whilst accepting there will be bumps in the road. So resilience and patience is really important, and a willingness to challenge the status quo with a solid evidence base to support this. Having the right staff in place to deliver on your strategy is critical too, not always poaching them maybe from another organisation. And this is staff who believe in its aims and the outcomes that the strategy sets out to achieve. As we have for flexible funding, we have drawn together a series of top tips. And as I still have a few more minutes, I will quickly go over these. Make sure that the board and the staff of the organisation have a shared understanding and respect of the strategy and revisit it regularly. Build the strategy around what your beneficiaries say is important to them and keep the dialogue going. In the early days of the Trust, senior staff travelled across the country to talk to people about the Trust and to hear what mattered to them and what they wanted to see change. Have a long-term vision that paints a picture of what you wish to achieve and fund against that strategy. Commit to longer-term funding relationships and explore collaborations with other funders where appropriate. You will hear a bit more about this when Colm and Nick have a chat a bit later on. Recruit staff who are genuinely committed to your cause, as demonstrated through the application and interview process. And as Neil has already said, it might mean borrowing from other funders. Recruit programme directors who understand the context the programme operates in and who are willing to learn more. Be driven by the needs of beneficiaries first and foremost, and prioritise relationships with them while being aware of other agendas that complement your work. Our work with people with dementia, with unpaid carers and with young people with care experience has always been front and centre to our approach and woven through all of the work that we have undertaken. This has not only been important, but has been a real privilege for the staff at the Life Changes Trust. Consider funding at an individual or local level. It can also be highly strategic. We have some fantastic outcomes from this. And I can't stress the importance of evaluation enough and use the evidence for shared learning and influencing activities. This has been so refreshing for me when I come into the Trust. It's not something that I had experienced in the past. And across both programmes, it was pretty unique until the Trust entered that landscape and has given us some really pretty major results. Allow the strategy to be flexible where necessary, with advantage to beneficiaries the primary consideration. And lastly, tip number 10, from the outset, think ahead of leaving a legacy of strong relationships, influence and funding that can build upon creating something even greater in time. Drawing on the last point, the ongoing relationships that the Trust has established now means we are handing over the baton to an extensive range of legacy partners who will carry the Trust's aims, priorities and values beyond its lifetime. We know that this will not work or look identical to what we have done at the Trust, but will build upon the Trust's work for many years to come. And just as a wee add-on, we plan on hosting events to shine a light on our legacy and formally announce legacy partners for both programmes. The legacy event for younger people with care experience takes place online on the 16th of February, and for our dementia programme, it is the 24th of February. So save the date and look out for details on our social media and e-bulletins. I know that the YPCE programme have already given some kind of tasters on social media already. We would love to see as many people as possible join us as we reflect over the last 9 years and celebrate what comes next in the next phase. So now back to Carol, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Arlene. Yeah, and a great job in terms of distilling all of that material in the two booklets down into that concise input. I love that line of every penny having a purpose. It encapsulates so well, I think, what we've tried to do at the Trust, not in a prescriptive way, hopefully, but by getting alongside people, listening and adapting. We've certainly all needed resilience and patience over the last few years. So there's a sense for me that strategic funding is a concept that's really found its time right now. So that's a brief look at the theory of flexible and strategic funding, but what does it look and feel like for a funder in practice? Over the years, we've worked alongside many other funders, and we particularly wanted to shine a light on the William Grant Foundation today. In November 2020, we opened a Caring for the Carer Fund to support the resilience of unpaid carers of people living with dementia during the COVID pandemic. The William Grant Foundation contributed £25,000 to the fund, and they also contributed to the Keep Well Fund, which we delivered in 2020, which provided small individual grants to support the well-being of young people with care experience during lockdown. Before the pandemic, the Foundation contributed funding to our Dementia Friendly Communities Initiative, our Technology and Dementia Project, and the Frameworks Initiative for Young People with Care Experience. We've really appreciated all this support from the Foundation and valued the relationship that we've developed together. So what made the William Grant Foundation want to work alongside the Trust? How do they see flexible and strategic funding, and what are the benefits of working in this way? To find out more, Nick Addington from the William Grant Foundation is joining us this morning, along with Colm McBriarty, a funding manager here at the Trust. Colm is one of the staff members that we actually poached from National Lottery Community Fund, so it feels quite apt that he is our star interviewer today. I'd like to invite them both to join me on screen now. Welcome to you both, and I'll just hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Carol. I should sort of being poached from the National Lottery Fund. It was a free transfer. I can assure you it wasn't. There was no value in me moving anywhere. Nick, thank you ever so much for joining us today for this discussion, which has the rather racy title of Funder to Funder, working strategically and flexibly together. You're also part of the Q&A panel later on, so I think you'll be getting double time today. Carol has given us sort of a quick summary of the work that the William Grant Foundation and the Trust has done together over the last few years. But I have to admit, even I don't know how it all began. So can you tell us a little bit about how the William Grant Foundation and the Life Changes Trust started working together, and maybe what it was about us that interested you?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Colin. Great to be here. Really love the way that the Life Changes Trust is sharing its learning with others at the end of its time. And yeah, I mean, I actually have a long history with the Life Changes Trust because I was involved in my previous role in doing some of the preparatory work on behalf of the Big Lottery Fund to set up the governance structure and the early structures of the trust. So I've had a sort of personal interest and a general interest in the Life Changes Trust, you know, really inspired by its big ambition. I like the fact that it had a flexible toolbox to work with. Interested in this limited time frame and the kind of sense of urgency that creates. And I think it's interesting to think, you know, all of us could probably benefit from getting up in the morning and thinking about what would it be like if we were going to spend out within a certain amount of time, and you know, what does that mean for us? So yeah, so I had a general interest and knew a bit about the Life Changes Trust. And then when I started working with the William Grant Foundation, we have very diverse interests ranging from the arts, the environment, through to health and young people. And one area that emerged for us quite early on was dementia, and that was related to personal experience of some of the people involved in the foundation, particularly interested in the situation of carers of people living with dementia. So after we sort of talked around kind of how we might think about approaching that, it became clear that we had quite a strong interest in the kind of community-based support that would exist for people in Scotland living with dementia, and that naturally made me think about the Life Changes Trust because of particularly the Dementia Friendly Communities program, which was part of the early part of your program there. So we got in touch and said, could we work together? And were delighted by the very collaborative and open response from Life Changes Trust about exploring our mutual interest around this. It made sense for us because, you know, we're a small funder with very diverse interests. You guys, as we've just heard, you know, have been really thoughtful about bringing a values-led approach, a relationship-based approach, engaging with the people affected by the issues that you're targeting. So it made a lot of sense for us to kind of stand on your shoulders, really, and come alongside and say, well, could we put some money into what you're doing and work in partnership with you? We actually do this a lot in the foundation, the William Grant Foundation. 20% of our funding pretty consistently over the last few years is actually spent not by us, but by other funders with whom we partner. We do this across all our themes. And the reasons for that are it accelerates our learning. Often we are quite new to an area, or we're very keen to learn more about a particular issue and what effective approaches are. And if we can stand on the shoulders of those who are already advanced in terms of understanding these topics, then we can accelerate our learning and piggyback on that. It enables us to benefit from the expertise and the reach and the scale of the partners we're working with. So Life Changes Trust was already running a dementia-friendly communities program. You'd run an open process to select the most promising projects. So we didn't have to. We came along and said, okay, well, let's come behind you on that and support some of these projects as well. And it's efficient for us. It means we don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of running a grants program. And it's efficient for grant seekers in the end as well, because they're not applying to multiple funders with separate processes, but they can benefit from support from two funders through a single process.
I can't help but think of the number of times when we were developing grant programs that I was just told, oh, William Grant are giving money to that, and William Grant are giving money to that. It just seemed to happen so often that there was just this bonus added to the pot that where you guys were putting your money in the pocket. So I think you've actually answered some of the next question, because we were kind of sort of, a lot of people watching this will know that you, rather than use sort of unsolicited requests for funding, you prefer to use this strategic approach of using research and networks. So, and I think you've actually kind of talked a little bit about that already, but why is that your preferred approach, and how does it actually work in practice?
Yeah, it's our preferred approach because it reflects our operating model and who's involved in the foundation. And ultimately, it makes the best use of our time and our personnel. So well, maybe just need to explain that we're connected to a family business, and the people that make decisions about the funding that we spend are part of the family behind that business. And it's quite an extended family, so there's quite a lot of people involved. And they're very proactive, they're very hands-on in terms of understanding the topics and identifying potential partners and being part of the relationships we have with them. If I can just step back for a second, we talk about our strategy as a funder as having kind of three key sort of points on a cycle. So it starts with learning, understanding an issue, thinking about what seems to be promising or effective approaches to addressing it. And then from that, we think about, well, who are the right partners that we can work with to try and progress those promising approaches or develop, fill gaps in evidence if that's what's needed, etc. And then we think about, well, how can our funding add the most value to the work that they're doing? And then that kind of feeds back into learning, reflecting on the process and thinking about, well, where do we go next? Who are the right partners for us to work with next? So our approach to finding the right partners is we talk about research and referral. So we'll do some homework and explore who's involved in a particular theme or topic. We'll speak to other funders that are already doing that. And we cultivate a network of people who can refer promising, effective, or dynamic organizations to us and say, we understand what your interests are. You might want to talk to these guys. And we're quite intentional about doing that, thinking about trying to do that well. So, cultivating relationships with knowledge partners like other funders or institutions that know the area well, and really kind of cultivating those networks. And that has benefits for us. It allows us to focus on learning. We can choose the conversations that we have and the reports that we read on the basis of what we want to focus on, rather than just what's coming in through the post. It shifts our mode of engagement to one of almost like appreciative inquiry. It's a very positive focus to what we do. It's reflected in our methodology, which is more about conversations than transactions. So, we start from the point of, well, who do we think is interesting? Let's talk to them. If we think there's promise, we keep talking to them, we work together to develop a proposal, and then we might fund it. So we spend much more time focusing on what we are going to fund, rather than fending off all the unsuccessful applications or dealing with all the unsuccessful applications that come in through an open process. It doesn't waste people's time, because we talk to people who we're interested in. Quite frankly, as someone who works in philanthropy and grant making, it makes the foundation a great place to work. It's a really interesting approach. There are some downsides. We don't know what we don't know. There are blind spots. We're all susceptible to biases in terms of how we approach problems or think about them. So to mitigate that, we do various things. We work with open funders, with funders like yourselves, who perhaps will be running open calls for proposals. So you're doing that kind of opening the opportunity for people to come forward with new ideas or to make themselves known. And then if we come in behind that, we benefit from that too. We're trying to build increasingly diverse networks and think about who we're not hearing from and where we could try and cultivate those connections. And ultimately, people can get in touch with us. We don't have an open application process, but there's an email address on our website and people can send us stuff if they think we might be interested in what they're doing.
There's so much variety with all the funders in Scotland, but I still think you somehow managed to still be unique and still be a bit sort of different. So it's two funders, the William Grant Foundation and the Life Changes Trust. Maybe we can talk a bit about our relationships with our grant holders and about what being a flexible funder means to us. So if you want to start, I'll throw in 50p in the meter after you.
No, I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. Yeah, reflecting on this before today's session, I think a sort of fundamental thing that it comes down to is about listening, about being open to dialogue, and trying to have genuine conversations with people, so you can really understand issues or what if it's an organization looking to fund, kind of what it is that they really want to do, what their priorities are, and what their needs are. Seeking and acting on feedback, I think, is part of it as well. Yeah, we're very lucky at the William Grant Foundation. We do have the freedom to be flexible because of the fact that we're independent. We also focus on organizations more than projects. So we try and find dynamic or promising organizations and think about how can we help them advance their mission, rather than saying we've got a very tightly defined set of outcomes and we're going to basically commission people to deliver them. So that does push us towards being more flexible. But I think all funders have some freedom to be flexible, and we can maybe talk a bit more about that later. So for us, flexibility is about what we fund, it's about when we fund sometimes, and it's about how we fund. And just one example of each of those, coming back to those open sort of conversations, honest conversations, we try to kind of get past this power dynamic that exists between applicants and funders and try to develop a relationship with a potential partner so that we can talk honestly about what their needs are. Sometimes people come to you because they think they have ideas what they think you might want to fund, and we try and get beyond that and say, well, what do you really need? So examples there are, we funded things like the Scottish Seabird Centre needed to overhaul its IT system, and we helped with the cost of that, and that's been a foundation for their operations. Not very sexy particularly, it's not about children and seabirds, but it's core to what they do. We funded the construction of toilets for volunteers at Bannockburn House near Stirling, probably the least sexy thing you can fund, but again, it was something that really needed to be funded. In terms of when, we're conscious that sometimes being timely, making an early decision or flexing our arrangements to be able to make a decision in between some of our core meetings can really add value to our funding sometimes. And then in terms of how we fund, we are open to shifting schedules for payments and reporting to make most sense to what the organization is doing. Sometimes funders say, well, we gave you a grant on this date, so we need a report 12 months from then, and that's when you'll get your next payment. And that may have nothing to do with their natural kind of program of work. So we try to be flexible in that way. I'm just going to mention it, but it would be a subject of another seminar. We also use unrestricted funding a great deal, and I think that's a very important part of being flexible as well. But I'm interested to hear your...
I think a lot of grant holders really appreciate that unrestricted funding, especially at this time. There's a lot of discussion about that at the minute. I think the only thing that I would add to that from the Trust's point of view is we've always seen our grants as an investment. That we feel that if we kind of give the grants and more than just money, so that if we kind of nourish those relationships and we kind of if we involve people in learning and we involve people in evaluation and we get them to share their knowledge and we help them with sort of future funding and alternative funding, then we get so much more out of the grant that we gave. You used the phrase there, power dynamic, which is something I've always been aware of. And I always say to people, it's the easiest thing in the world to give away somebody else's money, but it's the kind of, you want the grant holder to feel that they are doing all the hard work, because they are. So being flexible with them is I kind of see that as our way of saying thank you to them for taking on the grant, for taking on the responsibility of that. So yeah, there's a lot of, I'm beginning to understand after years of working with you exactly why we are working with you. The last question that I was going to ask you about was really, what do you think are the benefits for the funder? So if any other funders out, kind of watching this, what would be the benefits to the funder of taking a flexible and strategic approach to funding?
Well, personally, I think it's about being effective and fulfilling our role and our mission. I think if you're inflexible, you're potentially undermining the ability for you to be as effective as you could be. We see ourselves as having a role within an ecosystem of funders, charities, agencies, civil society working to make the world a better place. And we think about how can we perform our role to best effect, because we're not doers. I think, and this has been alluded to in the session already, we're not the people doing the work on the ground. We're just the donors. And so we want to be a trusted and valued partner, enabling doers to be collectively effective on the issues that we're interested in. So for us, being flexible, being open, developing relationships that hopefully are built on trust or established trust, means hopefully that people are more interested in working with us. We'll have people come to us with ideas and bring opportunities. And between us, we're more likely to find ways of working together that are mutually valuable. Being flexible, being strategic, open space for creativity and innovation. And we've heard that in terms of some of the ways the Life Changes Trust has worked. Sometimes open to challenge as well, but I think that's good. It allows you to learn better and faster, and it's more rewarding and enjoyable for us and for our trustees as well, I think.
Nick, thank you ever so much indeed for your help today, and for all the money and the support and everything that you've kind of helped us with over the last few years. And we will see you again in the Q&A shortly. But thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Colin. Thanks.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Colin and Nick for that interview there. It was so interesting to hear about the William Grant Foundation's approach. Whilst it's a unique approach to the foundation, it's also very outward looking, which creates lots of opportunities for collaboration and relationship development. The themes of listening, being open and relational have already arisen quite a bit this morning in terms of strategic and flexible funding. And it was good to hear Nick making explicit mention there of the power dynamic. This is so live in the funding relationship, and being aware of our power is so important, I think, if we want to be genuinely flexible. And that final point about the reward and the enjoyment of working in this way, I think, is a crucial one, and one that's come up quite a bit as we've been evaluating the Trust's work, that actually we as the staff get a lot out of working in this way, as well as the people that we're alongside. So Nick, as Colin said, will be joining us in the Q&A panel very shortly. So do remember to post any questions in the Q&A that you might have. So next we're going to talk more about flexible and strategic funding, but from the perspective of grant holders this time. So we spoke with two people who've received funding from the Trust, Julie Twaddle and Gary Brown, about their experience of the Trust as a funder. Gary's now working on the development of the National Leadership Network for Young People with Care Experience, which is at the centre of our legacy plans at the Trust. But he was formerly lead officer for Perth Champions Board, which received Trust funding. Julie's a director of Dementia Friendly Prestwick. They received a £15,000 award from the Trust to pilot the first dementia meeting centre on the west of Scotland. We gave our roving reporter Colm the job of catching up with Gary and Julie, and he was joined this time on his duties by Mary Reid, I have to confess that we also poached Mali from National Lottery Community Fund, so there's maybe a bit of a theme going on today. Here's what they all had to say.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming here today. And a special thank you to Julie and Gary as well, who's joining us. We are talking today about the fascinating subject of strategic flexible funding. So we're going to be talking a little bit about sort of flexibility with funding, you know, from the point of view of the funder and the grant holder, and we'll also touch on strategic funding as well. So I'm going to start with you, Julie. Of course, the fabulous dementia-friendly Prestwick received £15,000 from the Life Changes Trust in July 2020. And I can remember your application arriving in April 2020. What a time to be applying for funding, because obviously that was just when COVID was starting to impact. So can you tell us a little bit about how your plans changed from the time when you submitted your application in March and April 2020 to the reality of actually delivering the project?
Yeah, morning everybody. So our initial application was to fund a pilot project that would see us open a meeting centre in Prestwick, and the funding would give us 3 months worth to test the concept. It would allow us to rent a venue and to hire 3 members of staff. So I'm sure everybody knows a meeting centre is like a social club for people with early to moderate dementia and their families. And we were so keen for ours to be the first on the west coast of Scotland that we didn't want to squander this opportunity though, because it was the biggest amount of funding that Dementia Friendly Prestwick had raised to date. And because the pilot project was due to last for 3 months, none of us felt there was a big rush to deliver something straight away when the circumstances weren't quite right. So we spoke with you guys, obviously, and together we agreed that it was much more important to change the mechanics so that the end result was still the same, which is a successful meeting centre opening up in Prestwick. So what we decided to do is fund a person to work on the strategy for Dementia Friendly Prestwick, achieving a successful meeting centre. And the flexibility was hugely important because it meant we could adapt to the circumstances. And as I say, instead of squandering the money, which is it's been a massive game changer for us, we could use it in the most responsible way possible. And the person that this fund has funded, we found the perfect venue, we've negotiated rents, and we've raised an additional £125,000 for the whole meeting centre project. So that's what the flexibility has meant to us.
And I suppose if you would have had to stick strictly and rigidly to what you had put down in your application, you probably wouldn't have been able to deliver that because of the circumstances that we all found ourselves in at the time.
Exactly. The stop-start nature of COVID guidelines would have just rendered it impossible. It would have sucked all our energy and enthusiasm out. It would have confused and frustrated the people that were looking to support, and it just wouldn't have been successful. It would have been a missed opportunity, which nobody wants. And you know, I think it took a bit of bravery, a bit of courage, and you showed good faith in us, and that really helped. It helped us to get to this point where we're now, we're possibly miles further than we would have been had we stuck to the original plan and had COVID not hit. So we're thrilled at where we are, and we couldn't have done it without sort of a very reassuring guiding hand from the funders, from yourselves.
Seeing as you made such a success of it, can you tell us, what does flexible funding mean to you, and what are you looking for in a flexible funder?
So in terms of flexible funding, you guys listened to us because we know what our community needed, and it wasn't the same solution doesn't suit every community, and nor should it. and for a flexible funder to recognise that yes, you're funding projects nationally, and there are certain themes that you are supporting because you've done the research into it, still how that adapts to the local needs. And the flexibility meant that we could do what we wanted to do at the time that it was right to do it at for the best possible outcome. And it's also for me personally, as the person who writes these funding applications, sometimes at midnight. The flexibility means that I actually find you get the best results, I think, when there's like a safe environment is created between the funder and the applicant. Because I don't want to ask for money in a false pretense. I don't want to get money in a false pretense. Because that doesn't work for anybody. So being able to ask hard questions, being able to be honest, I think is very valuable. And that's a hard thing to get, especially when the funding landscape changes. So Colin, you're a trusty pair of hands, and we've lent on you hugely, and it's been appreciated.
The Mental Friendly Press made such a success of it, and I think a lot of the reason for that is the fact that we had a really good relationship with you, but you had a really good relationship with your volunteers and your board and now your staff and everything as well. So all that investment in that has helped. I think that's kind of where we would want to kind of take it from there. And I think I'm going to hand over to Mary, if that's okay. Now, thanks very much, Julie.
Yeah, definitely. It was so good to hear a lot of what you've been talking about, Julie, because I think now I'm going to chat to Gary. He will understand and appreciate, and hopefully a lot of it will resonate. As I mean, Gary, you've worked in a local setting at local authority level, and then you've worked at national level in relationship with the trust. So you've worn some different hats. As a funder, I think we try to support people when they're faced with blockages and challenges, like some of the things we've heard Julie talk about. Has flexibility been a key factor in your relationship with the trust too?
Definitely, Mary. I think if I think back to when I was sort of doing the work with Perth Champs Board and sort of leading on the corporate parent and youth work, the whole thing with Life Changes. So I think it was really interesting that the relationship with the staff was really important to the work that we were doing, and that so it kind of felt like the Life Changes Trust staff you were engaging with were part of the work you were doing locally. That's how it felt like to me. And if there needed to be sort of changes of focus because of, well, COVID, but just because of people's lives and things that were going on, and people maybe trying something and going, oh, this isn't working, maybe we need to slightly look at things this way and change direction. And that maybe then changing timelines and all that kind of thing. The working with Life Changes Trust was brilliant in that you were never thinking, oh, is this going to be a problem? You were like, oh, we'll need to have a conversation with Life Changes Trust staff who will be lovely and nice and understanding and person-centered and all that kind of good stuff. So when you know, whatever you had to, the steps you had to take forward, it was never felt stressful at all, because you knew you just had to work through what the issue was.
And we've gone from kind of talking about some of the local stuff to national level stuff as well. And I think I want to bring the conversation around to this idea of being a strategic funder and making strategic investments in things. You know, for us, some of that strategic investment, or most of it, is about bringing young people's voices to the fore so that they can affect really informed system change. Do you see this sort of, the way that you've interacted with the trust, you see those investments as being strategic, and the work that you do right now as being strategic?
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually like thinking about that when you were asking the question, Mary. I almost think other people are seeing that as well. So just an example of that is there's like 3 organisations who, before we've even really set up the National Leadership Network, want to work with us, that being Collective Leadership Scotland, Education Scotland and Health Improvement Scotland, obviously all national organisations. And what they've wanted to do is work with us because of the way we're working, and for that to influence their strategic thinking. They like, the thing that all of them have said that so far what they've seen with us is that we say we want to have young people front and centre in all aspects of the work we do, including the strategic thinking and all the strategic work we do, and that we're doing that. So they're kind of seeing that we've said, we will do this. Oh, and they have done it. Oh, how did you do that? So, you know, I think that's really good that, you know, how we're looking at the strategic part of the National Leadership Network already is influencing other people nationally. So that's fantastic to me that that's you can see that happening already. That's really, really exciting. And those organisations we'll work with throughout the next 4 or 5 years, hopefully, and things will develop. But as well as the more you do that, I think other people are then looking and saying, oh, that's interesting. That could help our kind of strategic thinking and like really involving the people that we're working with in decision making all through everything we do.
It's brilliant to hear that as part of the legacy of the Trust, you know, being a sort of connector, supporting people to work strategically together has always been something we've been very focused on. So I'm going to finish now actually by asking both you, Gary, and you, Julie, a question. So I'll start with Gary and then we'll finish with Julie, if that's okay. So this is the $1 million question. What is your headline message for other funders today?
I would say flexibility, obviously, but I think it's more than that. I think it's being person-centered, trying to understand the people that you're working with, how you're going to do that, build relationships, have relationships with the people that you're trying to work with and the people who support them. I think that's huge. I think that way you come across, you know, an interest, and this may be a good thing to finish off with. I never ever see Life Changes Trust as a fund, and I never did, even when they were funding all the work I did in Perth. I never actually thought of the organisation as funders because they were so about people. I saw it more as being, so I wasn't thinking of money. I was thinking of people in relationships from the off. And still now, being a part of Life Changes Trust, I'm like, it's so about the people. It's not about, you know, structures that are like that and things, and it's not that. So I think, you know, just looking at the way that Life Changes Trust staff have been about relationships, about people, about inclusion, all that stuff that needs to be integral to the dementia world, to me, and the care experience world.
Thank you, Gary. Julie?
I would say be ambitious, be confident, and network. And I must add, I think the reason you invited me on to talk about flexible funding is because I actually find it quite hard to ask for help. I come from the private sector, and you know, for a while I sold advertising. You know, I'm all into contracts and negotiations, and when things change or get difficult, I think my default position is to say, oh, I'm breaching the contract, I've broken the contract. And Life Changes Trust were the best. It pretty much has hit me over the head with a willingness to talk, and you have helped change how I make funding applications for the better. So I feel this has been some kind of intervention for me personally to say that funders are just people. So talk, share your passion, make your funding applications relevant and engaging, because it's regular people who will be reading them and making the judgments. So just that would be my advice.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Colm?
I've got nothing else to say other than thank you very much. I mean, from our point of view, we've always kind of seen the grants as an investment. And if you don't look after that investment, the investment's not really going to pay back. So thank you all very much. I think that's about us. Thank you so much for kind of helping us along here today. And we really appreciate everything that you've kind of done. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Many thanks to Gary, Julie, Colm and Mary for that recording. It was so interesting to hear Julie say that she felt the Trust showed a bit of faith in her project and that she felt listened to, that the Trust wasn't trying to impose a one-size-fits-all approach. We've always tried to focus more on people than on outcomes, and I think that was reflected in Julie's input there. That idea of a safe space in the relationship where both parties can be honest, ask the pertinent questions and work together to get to the right place is such a strong one. And it was also great to hear Gary's perspective on how the Trust's emphasis on the voice of lived experience is having a strategic impact nationally. Okay, it's now time for our panel question and answer session, which will be chaired by my colleague Mary.
Hi everybody, it's so nice to see your faces today. Now we've met some of you already this morning, but we've got a few new faces here. So I'm just going to, for the benefit of the people in the audience, start by taking a wee moment to let you introduce yourself. So I'll start with you, Roddy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Roddy Byers. I'm Head of Funding at the National Lottery Community Fund. We distribute about £60 million a year in funding to lots of people, mainly in the third sector. Thanks very much to the generosity of people who play the National Lottery and buy tickets. And it's only through their involvement and engagement that we are able to bring those resources to the table. We, as you've seen in the presentations, have a strong link to Life Changes Trust through some of our money. And I'll probably say a wee bit about that later on if that helps people.
That's great, thanks Roddy. Celia, I'll hand over to you now.
Hi, morning everyone. My name is Celia Tennant. I'm the Chief Executive of Inspiring Scotland, and it's almost our 14th birthday. So tomorrow will be the anniversary of launching Inspiring Scotland to Scotland and the world. And we started off with a very bold ambition to raise 100 million to tackle the challenges of youth unemployment, which is a crisis point in 2008. And we call ourselves a venture philanthropy organisation. We're not endowed, we're a funder, but we have to raise money before we can put out the door to the amazing organisations we work with. Over the 14 years, we have done as much as we can to be a strategic funder. So our first fund was a 10-year fund, the 14-19 fund. So alongside amazing organisations for 10 years to address youth unemployment over the course of that time. And wherever we can, we advocate for long-term funding. And music to my ears, and all I've heard this morning, trusting relationships, putting the money in the hands of the experts that know what to do with the money, being alongside. Brilliant, and well done Life Changes Trust. I look forward to answering some of the questions.
Great, thanks Celia. And Florence, finally.
Morning everyone, I'm Florence and I'm the National Head with BBC Children Aid in Scotland, and we're probably better known as Team Pudsey. At the core of our work is the belief that ability is everywhere but opportunity isn't. And through the generosity of the public and our supporters, our grant funding is able to support projects who create those opportunities, and it's a clear partnership that we've got with them to support children and young people in Scotland and the rest of the UK.
That's great, thank you Florence. So as a first question, I'm going to pick up, Roddy, you'd offered to expand a wee bit on things. I'm going to start with you if that's okay. So you were with the Big Lottery Fund as it was known at the time when this significant endowment was made to the Trust. And I know that part of the thinking behind it was that an independent trust could distribute the money in a slightly different way, you know, maybe taking this longer term, more strategic view, taking a bit more risk, maybe being a bit more flexible, as we've said, and staying focused on really putting the people that we're here for at the heart of everything. What do you think are the kind of key things that the Community Fund will take away or implement from the Trust's learning?
Thanks, Mary. It's good to touch on that. So one of the reasons that we were interested in establishing a trust was so that an organisation could do some things which were difficult for us as an organisation, as a funder. Some of that is related to us being a public funder and some of the restrictions in terms of how we can operate. And so our ambition was to create an organisation which could absolutely do things that were very difficult for us and do them in different ways. And I think we can see from what Life Changes Trust have done that we've managed to achieve lots of that. And of course, we haven't just come to year 9 and decided that it's a good time to learn some stuff. We've been talking with you on the journey for all of that time and learning things as we go, looking for cross-fertilization, looking for opportunities, thinking about whether or not we do things in the right way, reflecting on the experience of Life Changes Trust. And I could probably take you back to a point before the trust even existed, where I had a conversation one morning which went along the lines of, this is stuck, we can't get over the line, we think you're the person who can take responsibility for this and make it go. Which was a very interesting starting point, because we were working with a range of partners, as an organisation, we were very nervous about taking our hands off 50 million quid, giving it to someone else and saying, thanks very much, we'll see you in 10 years' time. And so our organisation was trying to de-risk that almost entirely. And the experienced and knowledgeable partners we were working with had done a range of good pieces of work in saying, this is enough. You just need to trust people at this point. And so I had one of those happy jobs of trying to resolve those different expectations on both sides. And I think happily we managed to get to a point where we managed to make things go. You guys will know some of the bumpy experience in the early stages about how that lands. But at least we got things underway. And some of the learning from us was that you can't de-risk everything. You have to trust people, you have to work with them, you have to listen to their knowledge and expertise, and you just have to let things go sometimes. So learning for us before the trust even got started, it was an interesting place to be. I suppose for those who are on the call, I would point to 6 things, what's useful, I think, in all of this is you can say as an organisation you've learned some things, but what have you actually done as an organisation in response to that learning? So you can pick up a book and learn things, and if you don't actually do anything with it, you haven't changed very much. So perhaps one of your challenges to us is, what have you done differently as an organisation based on what you've let loose in this Life Changes Trust? And if there are people here who understood the makeup of an organisation 9-10 years ago and look at it now, hopefully you will see not only differences in structure and behaviour and workflows, but you'll be able to touch those and feel them in different ways. So at the start of Life Changes Trust, we were an organisation organised around programmes with themes, trying to make a strategic difference. All of that's fine. And if you look at us now, we're an organisation which still wants to do some of that, but instead of being programmatically driven, we are now driven by relationships and trying to work more closely with people in their communities, in their settings. And we've reorganised our staff to try and achieve that. So these are some things you should be able to point to see that we've been listening and learning and then taking action. And probably 6 things I would just highlight. The power and importance of good quality trusting relationships is such a good base for any kind of funding. And we've been trying to move in that direction based on some of that learning. Co-production, which is there is a feature in Life Changes Trust work, which builds trust, equity, and shared responsibility. I would say that trying to establish those types of relationships are also good. Flexibility has been mentioned a lot, but the importance of moving and changing on the journey. So on day one, when you fund somebody as a funder, they have a plan of some kind. It's very unlikely that that will be the same plan on the last day, because things change and move, and it's important to be flexible in your funding to go on the journey with people, not just where they started from.
Roddy,
learning.
sorry to push you on time. I'm just conscious we'll need to listen to a few others, but are you okay just to list the final 3 if that's all right, and then I'll move on to the next question. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Learning, trying to build that in from the start, from day one, and not do it at the end. change and risk are linked. So if you don't take risks, quite often you don't change very much. And the last thing I would probably highlight from Life Changes Trust is about how do you end things well. So Life Changes Trust had a finite length of time, and they've done what I would regard as a good ending. And sometimes we struggle to do that well.
That's a great one to end on, actually. No, thank you for that, Roddy. And one of the things you picked up on there was risk. And actually, Celia, I want to bring you in if that's okay. I mean, at Inspiring Scotland, you obviously distribute funding and deliver projects alongside such a wide range of partners. And some of the challenges associated with maybe administering public monies is something I wanted to pick up on. So things like annual budgets, shorter timescales, maybe a bit of risk aversion, actually. They can jar a wee bit, you know, with your values as wanting to be an open and trusting grant maker. Do you feel that funders are making some headway around this, maybe pushing good funding practice forward where you can?
I think there's so much more to do, Mary, to be honest. And I think, you know, this morning is listening into all the contributors that Life Changes Trust was established with a very clear sort of mandate, with a very clear focus on specific issues to be dealt with over a long time. And that's where Inspiring Scotland came from, a very intentional approach to identify difficult issues for Scotland and fund the experts over a long period of time. When we talked about landscape change in 2008, and we didn't start with a blank sheet of paper. We started with the learning from other funders in Scotland. We were incubated by Lloyd's TSB Foundation for Scotland, who took all of their learning and said, okay, is there a different way we can fund the third sector? How can we use our learning? And Inspiring Scotland was created as a different way of funding. Now, there's a huge amount of similarity, but our principles are long-term funding, back the experts, not just money, lots of relationship-based trust, flexible funding, all of that. And we've been able to do quite a lot of that because we've had amazing investors on the journey, Scottish Government included, but also private investors and trusts and foundations. But you know, we and Life Changes Trust are sitting on amazing evidence, and Nick as well, and many other funders, that actually if you put money into the hands of the experts, our third sector partners, you trust them, you give them flexibility, you can make a bigger difference. There's much less churn, there's much more strategic focus and intent, but we're definitely not there. We're not there, and I think it's being here today is a bit of a reminder to me that actually we need to be using the evidence that we've gathered that actually this is a better way to fund the third sector for all funders, public sector as well, is over the long term. And we've got a collective responsibility to be pushing that message and using the evidence that we've captured, because so much time is wasted in the churn. And actually this time of year is particularly difficult for many organisations funded through the public sector, because near the end of January, we don't know about funding from 1st of April yet. And it's a really difficult time for amazing people in our sector, and not just them, but the people that are there to support. So I suppose I'll just finish on, today it has been a joy to listen into. There is so much that we know about how to fund for great outcomes, but we need to really push and use that evidence for different funding, and you know, across the board, trusts and foundations, but also the public sector.
Thank you, Celia. I want to bring Florence in a moment, but because we've not heard from you yet, Florence, but first of all, I'm just going to pick up, if it's okay, on that point around learning. Arlene, is it okay to bring you in just now? Because we've had a question in the Q&A. So it says, how do you approach building in an evaluation process that gathers robust learning from funded projects, whilst also being accessible and flexible and not putting too much extra work on those projects? And I think that's something that we all have good experience of, particularly you at the Trust. So
thanks, Mary. Yeah, I saw that coming in, and I think it's, you know, it's a lot of what we've said already. You know, it's something that we communicate with awardees at the very start. It's part of our application process. We talk about the importance of learning, the importance of evidence, and their kind of ownership for that, as well as what we advocate at the Trust. It's then about that relationship and about funding management staff working alongside, you know, grant holders around what that looks like. And it will be proportionate as well, because we have many grants that are small, but we also have lots of grants that are very, very big. So it's making sure that we're realistic about what we're asking of projects as well. and that we develop it alongside them. So many of our projects, particularly, I mean, I can reference the dementia programme because I oversee that. You know, in the early days, we would have worked alongside those groups of projects to look at the evaluation framework, to look at what kind of monitoring would be required, and then we would develop that with them and answer those questions, address some of those challenges, and make it a kind of realistic prospect. And I think it's then about talking to them about the impact of that further down the line. So what that evidence and learning will do, you know, both for them, but also for the group of people that they're working for, but also nationally in terms of policy and practice. And what we've also seen, just to finish, is that it really then provides a really strong emphasis for the projects themselves around evidence and impact, so that when they go on to apply for future funding, they have that infrastructure in place. They have learned so much about the importance of that, and then are definitely more empowered and more confident in terms of drawing evidence together to apply for new funding or to look at other ways to develop their own services. So yeah, it's all about good communication, good relationships, being proportionate, and really just seeing the kind of real impact of what that evidence can do in the longer term.
That's great. Thank you, Arlene. And having worked on so many of the evaluations, I think one of the big things I think of is the products that come out of them are for everybody. And I love seeing the people that we've worked with really wanting to make use of them. And that's the test of a good evaluation, isn't it, I suppose? Florence, I'm going to bring you in now, if that's all right. And we've had another question in the Q&A. Nick, I'll pass it over to you in a second. But first of all, I think this will be a good intro to it. So Florence, BBC Children in Need, you've got a really close relationship with the projects that you fund. It's clear for everyone to see. We've always been quite open about your aspirations to maybe redistribute power a bit, involve more people with lived experience in your grant making. Are there any aspects of the Trust story or learning that you found particularly helpful as you embark on that journey?
It's a bit of a cheats answer here. I could say everything that Roddy and Celia said. You could have just let Roddy go on for a bit longer and he would have probably covered it. We're at a really exciting time for children in need, I think, just now. You know, we're reviewing our charitable ambition and we're developing a new grant making strategy. And all of this we're trying to underpin by sharing power with children and young people, which is always easier said than done. And for me, I suppose one of the main takeaways from the Trust's work and from earlier conversations in the discussion this morning as well is that there isn't a magic bullet. It'd be great if we said we've got a strategy or we've shipped in a consultant or a specialist to do it for us. It's about the time that it's taking you to do it. It's about the commitment that's obviously been there throughout the organisation and the funders and other supporters. And I think as well, really importantly, a willingness to try things, to get things wrong and to learn from it. And it's that bit about not being frightened of risk. And risk is really just trying things out. You know, it's not a bad thing, and recognising that's something that's important to do and something not to be frightened of. And what has come through all of the conversations earlier on is the importance of the culture of trust that you've built. And that's clearly evident and has only seems to have got stronger over the last sort of 10 years or so. So for me, where you seem to have got to is that sharing power is just embedded in how you get things done. And my ambition, I suppose, for children in need, and I know some of my colleagues who are involved in developing the grant making strategy involved in the call as well, is that we get to that stage where sharing power stops having to be something that we mention. It stops having to be something that we have to refresh at a strategic level every 2 or 3 years. And the reason we don't have to do that is because it's become part of our organisational muscle memory. And I think that that's where the Trust seems to have got. And that's where I would really hope that children in need could get to as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that, Florence. And Nick, I'm just going to hand over to you now to answer this question that's come in, and it's about that sort of flexibility. So it's a question from Ellie, and it says, what do panellists think is the greatest obstacle to funders adopting a more flexible and strategic approach? And what are your suggestions for overcoming these obstacles?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I mean, I think, first of all, I think in terms of being flexible, you know, there's a kind of continuum, I guess, in terms of sort of what that looks like. And the William Grant Foundation is probably at one end of that, certainly one end of that. And I think that for funders, it shouldn't, the message for funders isn't that we should all try and be up there at that end of the spectrum tomorrow. It's more about the direction of travel, I think. So it's start where you are and do what you can in terms of thinking about things that you could change, things that you could maybe stop asking for or requiring your grantees to do, where perhaps, you know, there isn't really added value. I think a lot of the reason for some of the kind of inflexible structures within the funding world, a lot of it is because we've sort of inherited this process, this paradigm that this is how you do things, and you have turnover within funders. So you kind of come into a funder and you learn the way it's done, and you assume that there are some tablets of stone somewhere that came down the mountain that say this is how it has to be done. And actually, when you go looking in the cupboards, those tablets aren't there, and you can actually start to question, well, why do we have this policy? And you know, if we overturned it or altered it, what's the worst that would happen? And I think you know, we've just talked about risk. You know, what's the worst that would happen if we actually, you know, let grantees report to us, you know, once a year instead of every quarter, or we switched some of those reporting processes to being much more flexible, or we allowed people to tell us when they were going to report back to us because it suits their time frame rather than it suits ours. So I think yeah, I think every funder, even those that are relatively large institutional, probably have more flexibility than they perhaps assume. You know, ultimately funders, most of us are independent organizations. We have different accountabilities. It's particularly complicated if you're distributing funds on behalf of the public sector. And I know there's been a question about that as well. But yeah, start where you are, do what you can. And just a practical thing, right now, there's a great initiative which we're part of. I'm sure many of the other colleagues on the call are too, which is run by IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research. It's a community of practice promoting open and trusting grant making. So funders can get involved in that and find opportunities to share in a safe space with peers about some of the things that they're struggling with and opportunities to maybe do things differently, take inspiration. So that's something practical people could do.
That's great, thanks Nick. I know we're getting close to the end, but I just want to ask a final question, and anyone can come in. Nick, I was particularly thinking about some of our experiences of working with you, and also Celia, where we, during the first lockdown, had an individual grants initiative running, and we were heavily oversubscribed, and we called upon other funders to see if they would want to participate and support us around this. And so many came back so quickly and so flexibly to say, yes, we want to be a part of this. And I just wondered how you balance that kind of long-term strategic thing with just being able to respond and know that that fits with your mission. Is this something that you think, you know, your trustees or your committee or your board have to be a part of, that, you know, that sort of culture? And Roddy, that might be something that you want to pick up on, thinking about the trust and thinking back to that committee that made these sort of kind of quite brave decisions, actually. Sam, do you want to pick up on that?
I'm very happy to pick up on it, and I think the way that we are able to pass on funding makes that sometimes quite difficult, Mary, to sort of, you know, come and be at the table and bring our own money, because that would come from our accumulated reserves, because we're very like the organisations we fund. We're a charity without an endowment. We have to go and fundraise, and then once we've got the funds, then we're able to deliver a fund. But I think what's been really clear from this morning and from when we were all thrown into the chaos and the crisis of COVID, was just when we all come together as funders, that it's not just about the money. It's wherever you can. Actually, I think sharing, and we've worked closely with Nick and William Grant Foundation as well, many other funders, actually, it just makes a lot of sense to pool resources financially, absolutely, when we can. And I would love to be able to do that more. But also just the know-how and the learning and other resources that can help the sector. So it just makes a lot of sense. And one of the things is that you've got to keep foremost, certainly for me, is actually just stop that busyness and actually think about, take a step back, be more strategic, and who can come alongside and help actually to make it easier for the people we're here to serve. And that is the people in communities, but also that particularly those organisations we're able to fund.
Thank you, Celia. Roddy, I'll come into you now, thanks.
Yeah, I think Celia touches on that, and the experience of the pandemic responses has been very, very interesting and lots to learn. But the best way to describe it for the last 2 years is that for a while the shackles were off, and it was about just doing the right thing, just do the right thing. And in that period, lots of funders were talking to each other. Government was talking to funders were talking to the sector, organisations were working in partnership. People were just doing things in their community. They don't need an organisation, we're just going to go and do this. So lots and lots of stuff to learn, and picking up on Nick's point about maybe that shows there is scope to be more flexible, to do things, to take more risk, to be lighter touch, to take hands off, and nothing bad is going to happen. Actually, people 99% of the time are well intentioned, and if you allow them to fill the space, good things will happen.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I see Colm's picked up on take the shackles off. You know, is a great way of saying it. Roddy, thanks. And Florence, I'll finish off with you.
Oh, well, that's always
no pressure.
an additional stress there. Well, I suppose it's just to agree with my colleagues. It was habit, and it's been lack of headspace, and to think about different ways of doing it. We get on with the job, and we get on with the day job, and just what Roddy and others have been saying. COVID, if there has been one benefit, is that we've had to operate differently. Part of the trust that we had in the organisations that we supported was that they knew best for the children and young people that they supported what was needed and how to adapt. We trusted them to know that that's what needed to be done, and we trusted them with the funding. The relationship was there to have that conversation, but we had to create that bit of headspace to change. We can't lose those lessons and go back to the old habits. And I think that that's really the sort of takeaway. If we are looking at adapting and changing and becoming more flexible and strategic, basically the point I think that Neil made earlier on, we want to make the best use of the resources that we've got to unleash or unshackle the resources and the potential that's out there in the communities that we all serve.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Florence. And just, I guess, one reflection from me is, having worked for different funders over the piece, working at the Trust, actually, it's felt like that the whole time, even before the pandemic. And, you know, you really do feel like the shackles are off, and when an opportunity comes up, you can just go for it. You know, you talk to the people in senior management, you talk to the trustees, and that's the way I always want to work as a funder if I stay in this world going forward. So it's just so nice to know that all of you as senior leaders and chief execs and all these funders, you know, are up for this way of working, and will carry on that legacy. So thank you for everybody in the panel to taking the time to answer all these questions. We really appreciate it. And we also really appreciate your support of the Trust work over the years.
I'd just like to echo Mary's thanks to our panellists there. The Trust's received lots of support from the funding community over our 9 years, and this has undoubtedly helped us to achieve our mission. I'm sure you'll agree that was a great panel session, and we hope this conversation continues in the funding world. As Celia said, there is more movement needed across funding bodies, including the statutory sector, towards strategic and flexible funding and the kind of practice that we've been discussing today. And that message from Nick, I think, of start where you are, do what you can, it lands really well in this context. As we've seen in the Trust across our work more generally, small changes actually can lead to much bigger shifts. So we're now at the end of today's webinar, and it's been brilliant to hear reflections from people that we've funded and funded colleagues. The Trust's focus on strategic and flexible funding has helped us to be brave at times and to take calculated risks, as we've been hearing. We've always been looking to that bigger picture in terms of what our funding can achieve and focusing on relational approaches, putting lived experience at the heart of our work. Flexibility and investment in learning have helped us to influence that bigger picture. We will shortly be publishing the overall evaluation of the Trust, which is being done by Stirling University, and that really captures the evidence of this impact and shares particular learning for funders. So please do keep an eye out for that. It's been such a pleasure to chair this event today, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have, and that you'll take away some learning points and some ideas for the future. You'll find the funded booklets on our website, and Deborah's been sharing the links for these as well in the chat. The webinar will also be available on the Trust website in the coming days, so you'll be able to share that with colleagues that maybe haven't made it, or if you want to catch up on some of the discussion again, and we'll also use our social media channels to promote that. I'd like to thank everybody that's taken part today, and also everyone that's walked alongside us and supported us over the past 9 years. It's those partnerships, relationships and trust that have made our work possible. And finally, thank you to all of you for giving us your time. We really value and appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.